Hi,
Yeah,
nice to talk to you again.
Yes, it's nice to talk again. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we will start with the basic science, and then we'll get into more sort of political discussion. I went to your lab when I came to Berlin in the beginning of the summer, and I saw the plants that you are working with, right? So you're working with Arabidopsis.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So they're rather tiny little plants, right? And
yeah.
So you told me they are kind of like the little white mouse that animal scientists use.
Yeah. So Arabidopsis thaliana is the model system in plant biology, which we are also studying. But it also exists in the nature, so we can actually find it almost everywhere here in Germany, especially.
Right.
So it's a weed, which means that it grows everywhere. It's very good in growing in a very poor environment, so on parking lots, and it has a rosette leaves and a small white flowers, which are very tiny and it's not a very beautiful flower, but it's quite small. I would say like 20-30 centimeter tall.
Right.
When it grows.
Yeah, the Latin name is Arabidopsis thaliana, right?
Yeah.
The Chinese name I looked up. The Chinese name is 阿拉伯芥 because is it from the Middle East originally, or just the name reflects that?
I don't think it's from the Middle East, but I don't really know. So it's most likely there are different places of origin. What now the genetic data is showing, because it exists almost all the northern hemisphere. It's found.
Right.
So but I think that it's believed to come from Africa actually,
I see.
From there to colonize to Asia and then to Europe. But there could be also different places of origin.
It's commonly used by plant scientists because it grows in many places around the world. Right?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I think in molecular biology and genetics, the reasons why plant scientists are using it is because it is very easy to grow inside in the greenhouse and in the grow chambers, and it's quite short generation time. So it's fast.
How long is the generation?
It's around 2 to 3 months from seed to seed, depending in which conditions you grow it. So in the wild, in nature, it normally starts growing. You can find them in April, May, and then they are flowering. It takes few weeks, and then I think in the end of May, June, they are already drying and dying, and the seeds are set. So it's only a few months one can find it.
Yeah, so in nature, it just flowers once a year, right?
Well, yeah, it flowers. There are, in some places, it can flower also twice a year. So I think that it's found in the springtime, but also in the autumn, August, September, one can also find Arabidopsis. So it's pretty good in flowering.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned flowering also because I heard from you last time that you are studying the flower size.
Yeah. So one of the things that we are interested in my lab to look at is how the flowers and the flower size is changing in plants. And we use the Arabidopsis as a model, and then we of course want to also, when we say that we use it as a model, it means that we are hoping that the information we get from Arabidopsis could be applied also to other species. So the long-term plan is also to look at the same thing in other than Arabidopsis species.
So you're researching the same the Arabidopsis with the same genes, but when they are grown in different situations, then the flower size will differ.
Yeah, so you are referring to the something that is called plasticity, and plasticity. We are especially interested in plasticity for many reasons, but which I can also tell you, but maybe first to explain what it is. So often we see that the phenotypes vary between the different individuals, so we can even look at as humans, we all look different from each other, and the plants look different from each other. But what we are mostly interested now to look at as well is that the plants and all organisms can change their phenotype depending on the environment where they are. So the same plant with the same genotype grown in one condition looks different from when it's grown in another condition. And this is called plasticity.
Yeah. So when you say phenotype, it means the body, the physical form.
It means the physical form, but of course plasticity can also be at the molecular level.
Molecular level, right, right. So so last time you said, I forgot the exact number. So 2 different temperatures and then the flower size differ.
Yeah. So we have been looking at flower size plasticity. So how the size of the flowers differ in different environments. And the first environment we looked at was to look at in 2 different temperatures. So we grew the plants at the 17 degree and 23 degree. So it's only 6 degree difference in temperature.
Mm-hmm. And then the flower size, how much do they differ?
So the flower size, so it was quite interesting. We grew many different ecotypes of Arabidopsis, which means Arabidopsis individuals collected from different places of the world. Mm-hmm. So these are genetically different. And what we saw is that most of them had the bigger flowers when they were grown at 17 degree, even 40% bigger flowers. Right. But some ecotypes reduced their flower size at the 17 degree. So this means that the different genotypes respond differently to these environments. So there is a difference in the plasticity.
Right. So I mean, I was trying to explain this to my friends. I was saying, just imagine humans, right? Let's say twins who have the same genes. But one grows up in a cold environment and one grows up in a warmer environment, but their sexual organs have different size. Flowers are sexual organs. So that's what the situation is for plants.
Well, this could then be, of course, this would be the effect. Yeah, this is kind of the environmental effect on your phenotype. What is then interesting for us was that there was differences in this environmental effect in different individuals. So that would mean that if we had the 2 different twins and then they would respond, 2 of them were grown in one environment and 2 in the other, and then if they would show different kind of response to each other, it would mean that there is maybe some genetic basis in this response they have to the different environments.
Right. So you're saying many genotypes show larger flower size in colder temperature, but some don't show this. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Does this have any relation with where they are collected from? Do they, any correlation with the natural environment where they grow, or no?
Yeah, so now, of course, what we want to understand is that what is the genetic, we would want to know what we are currently doing is to understand that whether there is genetic basis in these differences in the plasticity. Right. And then whether it has some whether it's adaptive. So plasticity can be adaptive, which means that it will somehow increase the fitness of the plants in certain environments. Right. And so we don't know yet, and we haven't observed any those that are getting smaller, for example, that they would come from a certain area.
I see. Okay.
But we must think that the environment is more than the area or the origin where they come from. So there can be local environmental factors that can differ and could be shared. Right. So.
Why? I mean, maybe just go back one step. Why is plasticity? Why is this flexibility in flower size and also other traits useful to plants?
Yeah, this is maybe we should have started with this question: why to look at plasticity? So I already mentioned that plasticity can be adaptive, and this is what we are interested, and this is what we believe is that this could be a way for plants to survive and better cope with the changing environments. So us humans, we can, when our environment is getting too bad for us, we can just run away, and also many organisms can move, but plants are not able to move. So for them, it's very important to be able to respond with their body or with the way they grow to the surrounding environments. And plasticity could be one way to do this. So they could maybe avoid some unwanted conditions by changing their traits and their phenotypes.
Right. So, so for example, when you look into flower, you not only look at flower size, you also look at the flowering time, right? Whether colder temperature affects flowering time.
Yeah. So we are looking at other traits, and flowering time is one good example of a trait that shows plasticity, and it may be easier there to understand why it's so important. So different ecotypes of Arabidopsis, they flower at a different time, because the flowering time, if we put them to the same condition, because the flowering time is adapted to from where they are from. So plants want to flower at the time when they know that they are not going to die. So it's no point of flowering middle of the winter, even if there would be one day of warm weather in the winter, because they know that they might die later. So this can also happen, of course, that what we know about the plant populations, that sometimes at the springtime everything flowers, and then if it comes very cold or frost, everything might die because of that. And that's, of course, not good for the plant, and it's not good for their fitness. And this is why plasticity could be one way also to be able to survive this kind of sudden environmental changes.
Right. I mean, I think in human culture, we also say people who are more flexible, who can adapt to their environment, sort of fare better even in contemporary society. Right? But we talked about this last time. We can talk a little bit more today. It's very, for me, what's really fascinating is when we think about human adaptation or flexibility, we often think about how we change our behavior, right? So let's say now I'm in Berlin, so it's cold, so I put on more clothes. The sun, the daytime is shorter, so I try to get up earlier, so I have more time during the day. So these are behavior changes. But when you look at flower size, that's a bodily change, right? So by living in Berlin, I can't, maybe I can increase my fat level a little bit, but I can't really grow more arms. Or let's say the temperature is dropping, I can't just shed all my muscles like, the trees are shedding their leaves. So I was thinking, the flowering time and then the flower size, one sort of flowering time is more like behavior, and then the flower time is more like physical change, right? So how... I
think this depends a little bit how we define what is behavior. I think behavior is just something that plants are doing.
Right.
Then everything that is when plants are changing something, I guess it could be behavior.
Of course, it's also whether we look at the action versus the result, right? So let's say the Arabidopsis decides to make the flower bigger, then that's like a behavior. That's the way I describe it. Will sound more like a behavior.
Yeah.
And then the result will be more like a physical change, right? So you sent me this article last time, what is plant behavior? But I was kind of, I think I started asking you about this because I feel like whether scientists pay more attention to plant bodily form, to its physiology, whether it's just the different focus or different terminology, where it's really because plants can change their bodies much more dramatically than we humans or animals can. I feel like there's both reasons, right?
Yeah, there are both reasons. also, as I said, because plants are not able to move, it's somehow more important for them, or it might have a bigger impact for their survival if they are able to change the way they look, or they, now if we call it body shape, or and of course, if we think of selection, it is acting on the visible phenotype. So what is surviving? So if we think of plant adaptation, what plants want to do, or what they aim is just to reproduce as much as possible. And that's kind of driving their behavior, I would say. And so then to be able to change their behavior in order to get to reproduce is important. Of course, their physiology is also changing, and I think this is also studied, and there is plasticity in physiology and at the molecular level as well. So I think in biology, more and more we try to understand the different levels of the organization as well. So from the genetic molecular level to the phenotypes, and also then to the group behavior, that how the impact with other surrounding species and organisms, how this is influencing. But in this needs more collaborative research. It's too much to look at everything. Right.
So I think for of course for humans, for us, if we look at the long millions of years, our phenotype also of course changes.
Yeah.
That's very visible. But I think maybe in our often when we think about human change, we tend to focus on the shorter term, and then in one generation, then it's more about behavior.
Yeah, you are right. It's but so I don't know if would you think that the humans are showing more behavioral plasticity in their behavior rather than?
I mean, that's what I thought last time, but now I'm thinking maybe it's just a temporal, it's just a time scale issue, right? Because when you study Arabidopsis, each generation takes 2 to 3 months. Yeah. Then you can see the generational changes very quickly.
Yeah, but plasticity, we would think that it happens within one generation.
Well, within one generation.
Yeah. Right. Well, of course, it's a change in one organism in different environments.
In different environments. So in that sense, yeah. So in that sense, we look at, in that sense, I feel like we are definitely not as flexible physically as plants, right?
No, I think we are not as. Yeah, you are right. I mean, when we cannot, for example, if we are cut out of a body part or something, we can't grow a new one, which plants can do, and the plants can change the way they look and where they grow, and many different things, and that us humans we cannot.
Right.
Do.
Right.
Probably so, it would not be beneficial for us either. I mean, we don't need to do it for plants. It's beneficial. So it's an advantage for them to be able to change. And this is what evolution is about, that we are seeing traits that are beneficial to be kept in population. And that's why I think we might expect to see more plasticity in plants, because it could be important for them.
Right. So, I mean, this has really kept me thinking since I came to Berlin, since I started talking to you, that when we think about human politics, we focus on behavior, right? So we go, like what's going on in the U.S. now, they're voting, they're counting the votes, etc. And for plants, when they practice politics, if we really try to understand how plants practice politics, then we really need to look at their bodily change rather than just behavior. So I think that's what's been making me.
So how would you define how would you define practicing politics? So if we say that plants practice politics, are you thinking of the kind of group? Well, how would you define this?
I mean, I'm hoping we also talk about this at 4 p.m.
Yeah.
But there are, of course, this is a huge question, right? So, for example, let's say, whether, for example, I think many of us are thinking about how to address environmental change. So, how to address climate change and the ecological emergency. So one thing, like for us, we recycle more. We try to consume less. So these are, to me, these are ways we. So these are sort of everyday politics that we practice. Right. So we can also gather and we can start a protest. We can set up an activist organization, etc. So these will be more on the sort of activist politics level. Of course, there are institutional politics, right? Like the voting, like the Congress, etc. So for me, so when I started talking to you, I feel in the plasticity can be quite interesting to think about our individual sort of everyday politics, right? So
what would be the political question? So now you mentioned, like, for example, how do we deal with the environmental change is one political question in humans. So how do you see what is the political question in the plants?
So that's, I mean, so I see it in the sense that plants are also thinking about environmental change, right? So they are also trying to address climate change. But their way of addressing climate change is to change their flowering time, to change their flower size, etc. So it's something that you actually study, but maybe you don't phrase it in a political sense.
I agree that, of course, these are like plasticity. It's a way for plants to cope with the change. But what I am wondering, what might be lacking in plants is that I don't know if plants are able to know anything of the future. So they are kind of only know what they have experienced now and maybe what has happened in the past. So, and for example, to understand that you are doing something for the environmental change, of course, we are also not able to know what will happen in future. We base our future predictions to the past, and maybe you are right in a way that plants are also, they have the past experience, and in that way, action could be political as well.
Right. So, I mean, but I think what you just asked me also made me think how to, whether what I'm starting to ask is just to change the way we describe different situations. Or there are things that we can start looking into that we haven't looked, right? So, for example, so what you are saying about predicting the future, right? So how do we know that plants can't predict the future if we don't set up certain research questions or experiments, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't think that plants, well, they are not having the intelligence that humans are having in order to kind of prepare for something that hasn't been there. But I think that they are kind of changing because of what has happened, and that's why maybe plasticity, that would allow them to change and respond to the changes in the environment, even if it's something unexpected, because the environment is now changing very quickly and rapidly, and they need to be able to respond. So keeping this would somehow imply that if they have this ability, it means that they are prepared for the changes, even though they don't know if they are going to happen or not.
Right, and they, it may not be a predictive capability, but it's ability to adapt. Right?
Yeah.
So it's a different model. Perhaps we tend to work on prediction and then we try to find a solution. But for them, they They just do it where they have the flexibility to cope with what's happening. So that's also a different, I mean, to me, that's also a different mode of politics in a way.
Yeah. But it's of course interesting to think of the plant behavior also from the using the political terms and thinking what if there might be something political in the behavior of the plants or the plasticity. I don't know if we think if plasticity is behavior or not, but I somehow think that plasticity could be a behavior more than well, it's also a trait in the plant.
I mean, for your research, does it matter what its behavior or its physical trait? Because you're looking into the genetic mechanisms,
yeah,
right?
So we think that that there is a genetic basis, and it is the ability to how much they are able to change or respond. So the amount of plasticity, that this could have a genetic basis, which would mean that it's a trait. Then we would name it as a phenotype more than a behavior. But it's still it's a response. So you need to have these two different environments, and you need to have the change. And of course, change might be seen as a behavior as well. So I think it's just a way to, different way of saying.
So there's another question I thought I haven't asked you last time. So what's the relationship between, say, individual plasticity and community level variation, right? So each individual plant can show plasticity to respond to change in its own flowering time, flower size, etc. But there's also community level variation, right? Yeah. That's also built in, right? So there are two changing factors, and they both adapt to environmental change.
Yeah. So as I said earlier, we talked, and I mentioned that we are looking at things at the different levels or different scales, and now we can look at individual plasticity. We can also look at the plasticity at the level of populations or at the level of communities or ecosystems. And all these are showing plasticity, and it's interesting to understand that what are the mechanisms behind and how to keep. Because I think in the changing conditions, everybody agrees that it's good to be flexible. Right. So if nothing would be changing, of course it would be good to be the optimal and not to change much, but we know that now conditions are changing, so it's good to have plasticity. And we see plasticity also at the level of populations, which and different populations. We have looked at plasticity in Arabidopsis populations, and we have seen that different populations have a different amount of plasticity and the variation in the plasticity. So in some populations, all individuals behave the same way, and in others there is more variability in the way they respond to environmental changes.
Right.
And
is there any conclusion which one is better? Is it always better to have more variability within a population when the environment change? Or
if the environment change, probably it's better to have more variability, because if we don't, the plants cannot know how the environment is going to change. So then, of course, it would mean that not the whole population dies if the environment is changing to something very unfavorable for the plants, or for the population. But of course, if the conditions are favorable and everybody would be having the favorable phenotype and the fitness would increase, then it would be good to not to have the variability, but it's rarely the case. So.
Yeah. So do you think the community level variability could also have genetic basis?
Yes, I think that there are population genetic methods. We haven't really looked at it so much, but I think that it probably has a genetic basis also, or genetic basis in the way of the variability. Yeah, as you said, the variability at the population level. I think that it can be genetically controlled, and that there is, we have seen that there is more genetic variation in populations that are more plastic that we saw. But of course now, when we don't yet know which genes are controlling the plasticity, we cannot start looking at how at the population level these genes are varying. So when we know what gene is making an individual more plastic, we can also look at how this gene varies within the population, and then we can see how it reflects to the plasticity at the population level.
Right. As you said, adaptation is there's a growing interest in adaptation because of climate change.
Yeah.
So I also thought, of course, many of us know now, even for humans, for us to address climate change, where it's not just about trying to keep the temperature as stable as possible. It's also to think about how we adapt as individuals, but also as societies, right? So I thought before we tend to focus on transforming the environment, I think so much of our human history is pivoted on transforming the environment. I think now we realize we also really need to balance the transformation and adaptation. And I think that's why, just talking to you and, learning from plants, how they, of course, they also transform the environment, right? But they also adapt to the environment.
They also adapt. I mean, that's the way of, they try to, I think you also, when you were talking with Regina at the end, she was saying that we are part of the nature and we should be seen as part of the nature. And I think that as humans, we often don't see us as part of the nature. If we were part of the nature, we would need to adapt. But now we are trying to change our surrounding to adapt to us.
Right, and then we kind of, I feel like we tend to over-exaggerate our ability to transform the environment. And we don't think enough about how to adapt. So I think what you're looking into, and I know many other scientists are looking into adaptation. So this could be I think it could be very, at least I think also politically, it's important for us to change our mindset.
I mean, nature is an environment is changing also without us human changing it, but that's what we are at the moment. We are making it to change maybe faster than it should, and that's why I think we have to study plant adaptation as such more and more, because the nature is not keeping up with us humans. So we are somehow changing our surrounding so rapidly, and we are not really adapting to the natural change. And this is then I've had artist ways, and I think plasticity, for example, is one way, or could be one way that now become very useful, that exists in the different organisms.
So I want to ask you, because plants can actually make assessment of multiple environmental change factors. And then they make then they either make decision where, they respond to the environmental change, different ways of saying the same thing, perhaps. So how, when you're doing research, you're looking at a single factor, right? And you're trying to identify genetic basis based on single factor experiments, right? So do you think later in the future, you will also look into how plants make assessment of multiple factors and make holistic decisions?
Yeah, so this is towards what I think plant research needs to go, but it's just very difficult to do research. It's difficult when you change many things and then you don't know what is the cause of the change. But this is really what many plant research are doing at the moment, is to combine different stresses and seeing what happens. And there are many trade-offs happening in plants when they have to decide that they cannot do what they want to do. So and they have to decide whether to defend to pathogens or whether to grow bigger. And this is one trade-off that exists between growth and defense response. And when we then give so many stresses, for example, pathogen rest stress and other stresses that influence the growth. What will happen? How do they decide what is more important to respond when they can't respond to everything? And this is really what researchers are trying to now find out, to give multiple stresses. And what we also can do is to do field studies. So we also have been growing Arabidopsis on the field and see that when they are in the natural conditions, what happens. But research-wise, this is quite difficult because it's not possible to repeat these experiments since we can never repeat exactly the same conditions. And so we observe something, and then next year we would observe something different because the environmental conditions are a little bit different. But you are completely right that this is something that is really needed at the moment.
And from the genetic level, I remember you said you imagine that the genetic basis will be more like a network of genes rather than sort of a single correlation.
Yeah, there are very few traits. If we now see plasticity as a trait and it has a genetic basis, also in many other phenotypic traits, they are very rarely caused by one single gene. There could be one gene that is controlling the most of the phenotypic variation, but it's often multiple genes that are controlling the phenotypes. You can hear me? I was thinking I maybe lost you for a moment.
No, I can hear you.
And also that there are genes that are in the network that control. So many genes can have a small effect on the trait, and then together they will make the bigger change or the phenotype what we see. So rarely genes are working alone.
Right. So I also want to ask you a little bit about, we have a little bit of time left. I also want to ask you a little bit about speciation. How is the idea of species related to plasticity? Because I think this is something I find it very hard to comprehend. Can you explain a little bit why is flexibility of their genotype? The phenotype traits actually has something to do with speciation, species.
Well, I don't think it's directly maybe has to do with the speciation, but I think it could have if it's adaptive and if it has adaptive advantage, it does play a role in evolution then, and it could be also selected for or selected against, depending if it's beneficial or not. And of course, the selection is the driving force of evolution. And but I don't think plasticity would be any mechanism for speciation or species formation as such. Of course, plasticity could. I would not. I could say if we think of the flower size plasticity. So it could be a source for more genetic variation in the population. So when the flower size is changing, bigger flowers are more likely to outcross than small flowers. And of course, now that I am talking and thinking of this, of course, if we talk about flowers and some other traits, if we now change a trait, for example, flower size to so small that the pollinators are not anymore able to find the flower, then we would have an event of or that the species are not surviving anymore because they are not outcrossing. So, of course, if it can produce some extreme phenotypes which would then prevent outcrossing to other species, it might, or flowering time in plants, that if now the environment would become such that that some individuals or populations are flowering at a different time than other individuals and they would never meet. Now I assume that outcrossing is needed. Then this would again be bad for, it would these would not anymore be outcrossing and would not able to survive. necessarily. So, yeah, it could, but I would not say that it's the first thing we think that it would be somehow driving speciation, or, yeah, it could increase the number of species or so on.
Okay.
But I believe every phenotypic trait could impact the interaction between species and the survival in some environments. So, of course, if your phenotype becomes such that you can't survive in some environment, then that species will be lost. So, yeah, I mean, in that
so it's
way.
one of, right.
Yeah.
So you I mean, going back to you mentioned what you mentioned earlier, right? You have to look. You are looking into the molecular level and genetic level, but there are. You said also it's important to look at the larger scale issues of ecological factors, right? There's also, not only looking at now, but also looking into the past, sort of temporal expansion of evolutionary models. And then, from individuals to population. So there are many, different, temporal, spatial, there are many different directions and different scales that you can look into this issue, right? So how do you as a researcher try to link these different scales and different axes?
Yeah, this is, I think, the big challenge at the moment that which we are facing as researchers, and to really combine across different. We are always doing our own research, and we are not often thinking what bigger impact it might have or how it could connect to the ecosystem level or to the ecology and I think that this really requires more collaboration between different scientists at the different fields. So we have to be able to combine the different fields of scientists and combine the knowledge we have. And also what is more and more important these days is to have bioinformatics and mathematical modelers and to make predictions, which then the biologists can test, because we are able to produce quite a lot of data at the moment. So we have, and this is only going to increase, I think, in future. So we are able to produce a lot of data, and it's not everybody who is able to then find the biological information from this data. So this is important. How can we use all the existing data that we have? And that this requires that we combine the different fields and we make bigger research consortiums, and I think that is what is happening at the moment in many places.
So I was going to say, if there are methodological innovations, so you're saying, like sort of data modeling is one of the new tools, right?
I guess it has always been there in some form, but I think now it's more and more needed because there is so much data, and it can really, I think the biologists can really benefit from this to be able to predict or make a model which we can then test. So it allows us to somehow make new hypotheses to be tested and to understand, also to understand and make predictions of the future then, based on the experiments we do and the data we have, that what might happen, how could we predict what might happen in future? Because of course we just as plants, we don't know what will come tomorrow for sure. So we can only predict what might happen.
But I mean, you always need people who can understand sort of, they can serve as links between different scales, right?
Yeah.
They can ask questions that actually can link micro level data with like macro level data.
Yeah.
So that will become meaningful.
And what is very important as well is to, as you mentioned, who can ask questions. So it sounds like a simple thing, but it's not always so easy to ask the correct question. I mean, we don't know when we know what we want to know, and when we are able to ask and define questions to answer to the problems we have, then it's also easier for the bioinformaticians, mathematical modelers, and to work across the fields. But sometimes it's very difficult to really be able to tell that what is the problem we have or what is the question we want to answer.
Right. Kind of going back to what I was asking earlier about plants making holistic decisions. Plants also have to synthesize many levels of data, right?
Yeah.
They also need to synthesize data at sort of molecular level, but also on the environmental level, right? Yeah. So ecological level. So how do plants make that kind of integration of different scales?
Yeah, I don't know if they like. As I said, that I don't think they are as intelligent as or have the same intelligence as humans have, or this kind of. So I don't. But I think that it's more. The scales need to work together, so all the scales are linked together, and the networks at different scales are in the causal, or I don't know if it's, but in the relationship to each other. And I think if you make a change that is not good, you will see it as a disadvantage in your behavior or phenotype or fitness. And this would tell the plant that, okay, this was not the good change at that level, it changed too much. So of course, when we make changes at any level, it will influence the whole system. Also in plants, but I don't think plants have a way of, like, we can predict a little bit. We can predict that if we change one component there, what will be the outcome. But I think that plants cannot do that. Something is changed and then they see what is the outcome and then maybe learn from there. But
do you think they can synthesize? They can aggregate signals and then make
that is the way they have
level.
signals which are they are able to communicate between the different. Of course, there is communication within the system between the different levels and different networks also in plants. But if there is but how would they optimize the system within one? I think that happens based on trial and error. And us humans are a little bit more. I think intelligent that we can guess that if we predict that if we do something, what might happen.
But maybe we need to have better communication through across different levels.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's really needed. But there is, of course, also some communication already. But I think it's always difficult in anything. It's also being flexible, I think, to be able to communicate across the levels and not only with, especially in humans.
Right. So there could be communication plasticity.
Maybe plasticity. You could plasticity in could be. That would be, I think, a beneficial thing in humans.
Well, I'm sure for plants too.
In plants too.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So we will stop here and then we take a break. And we will get together with Regina and Matthias at 4, and then we can also continue the conversation.
Thank you. Okay. It was nice.
Thank you, Roosa.
Thank you. See you.
We'll see you at 4.
Okay. See you.
Okay.
Bye.